Yes, we are complete. We can start.
Okay, thank you. My name is Caroline van Heugden. I'm the pro-rector of this academic ceremony. And with this, I open the academic ceremony in which PhD candidate Mónika Tóth will defend the academic thesis called Processing in Novelty and Familiarity in the Aging Brain. And to start with, I would like to invite you to present the results and the conclusion of your thesis. The floor is yours.
I was muted. Dear Prorector, thank you very much for giving me the word. I will now start sharing my screen and show you the slides that I have prepared. So, dear members of the degree committee, dear audience, in the next roughly 15 minutes, I will show you how our brain processes, responds to, and distinguishes never before seen abstract visual and verbal materials. I will also shed some light on how this might change as we grow older and wiser. But first, please let me introduce you Margaret. Margaret is a happy and healthy, proud grandma, 21 years old psychology student, that she has specifically difficulties when she has to learn new things, such as how her smartphone works. She oftentimes gets confused and taps the wrong icons, whereas she wanted to do something else. And this gets even worse when Joshua installs new applications on her phone. This reminded Joshua of an experiment that he has recently participated in. In this memory experiment, Joshua had to memorize, learn, and later recognize never before seen abstract images and non-words. Well, Margaret looks surprised and wonders, how could somebody even remember these? And why not just to study objects and words that we know and use in everyday life? Joshua explains to Margaret that her lifelong experiences and knowledge in some cases can benefit her memory, while in other cases it can hinder it, eventually sometimes leading to confusion. Knowing how our brain processes and responds to items which do not rely on existing memory representations can help us to isolate pure memory effects, which on the long run could help Margaret to become better at using her smartphone. Joshua decides to share some techniques with Margaret, how she eventually could improve her memory. According to Joshua, it should be possible to strengthen Margaret's memory, and this could be achieved in two ways. The first being if he would repeatedly show the items to her. And as we all know, repetition makes the master. The more times we engage in something, the better we can become at it. However, there is another way. He could also ask her to redraw the abstract figures or come up with existing rhyming words for the non-words. This would induce deeper levels of processing, which eventually could lead to better storage and better retrieval. This is the basic idea of the levels of processing theory, according to which drawing would lead to the best storage and reach the deepest levels of processing, resulting in better memory. It also means that the traces leading to the memory would be multiple and more durable. This level is closely followed by the rhyming task, which would reach intermediate levels of processing. Both of these methods would lead to better storage and retrieval. In contrast, if Joshua would ask Margaret to simply study the items, it would only reach shallow levels of processing, so poorer memory performance. Now, based on this little introductory story, I would like to share some of the main aims of the current work. I was interested to further characterize the processing of abstract figures and non-words, and to investigate how and whether memory strength could affect such processing. I was also interested to see how the underlying brain processes could look like, and whether Margaret's complaint would be applicable to her peers. In a final study, I investigated a medication that normally impairs memory, and I wanted to see if it could model age-related recognition memory deficits. In order to investigate these questions, we designed a three-phase memory paradigm. The first phase was meant to induce deep memorization. And I did as Joshua was suggesting. I asked the participants to redraw the abstract figures and come up with existing rhyming words for the non-words. If you still remember, the other way to induce stronger memories was to repeat the items. So in the second phase, I repeated the items from the first phase, and I intermixed them with some new ones. And here I asked the participants to merely study the stimuli. After a certain period of time, I applied an old new recognition test. In this phase, items from the first and the second phase appeared again mixed with some new ones. And the task of the participants was to decide whether they had seen the stimulus or not, meaning it was old or new to them. I also measured their accuracy, meaning how well and accurately they could identify correctly the new items and recognize the old ones. And I also measured their response times, so how fast or how slow they were when responding. If you still recall, Margaret was suggesting to study objects and words that we know and use in everyday life. And Joshua was hinting to the fact that it sometimes can be confusing. So in this experiment, I wanted to investigate whether it matters that a specific memory has an existing memory representation or not prior to the experiment. I had two groups of healthy young volunteers in this specific experiment. One group received items and words that we all know and use, so these were well known to the participants. The other group, however, received abstract images and non-words, so items which did not probably have an existing memory representation. I was expecting that the memory strength manipulation would work, namely that the items that were encoded with more deeper levels of processing and repeated would be more accurately recognized and also faster compared to the ones which were merely studied. The results with the visual items confirmed my expectations, namely the items that were drawn and repeated were recognized better than the studied ones. They were also recognized better than the new ones. And finally, the new items were recognized better than the studied ones. And this indicates an effect of memory strength. And there was one particularly interesting finding which concerned the new visual items. Namely, the abstract images were recognized better than the figures that were well known to the participants prior to the experiment. There was also an effect on response times. Namely, the reactions were faster in response to the drawn than the studied items, and they were also faster when participants had to respond to the items which were well known compared to the ones which were not known. The results of the verbal items were very similar, again showing an effect of the memory strength manipulation. Namely, the items that were stored with the rhyming task and repeated were recognized better than the studied ones. They were comparably well recognized compared to the new ones. And the new items, yet again, were recognized better than the studied ones. In terms of the response times, however, it did not matter whether the item had an existing representation or not. In the next experiment, I wanted to investigate how the underlying brain processes could look like. And for this, I used electroencellography or EEG. With this funny cap and the attached electrodes, it is possible to measure brain electrical activity. And what you get as a result is this neat waveform, which has an amplitude reflecting the magnitude of the signal given at a certain time point. And you might ask yourself what the numbers and the letters stand for. And these reflect event-related potentials, which occurs time-locked and also in response to a specific event. So if you would think about making the old new decisions, the signal might be different. In this particular experiment, the waveforms of interest for us were the N400, which is a negative deflection, occurring around 400 milliseconds. It is typically larger for items that are new compared to the ones which are old. This particular ERP is also assumed to reflect familiarity type memory. Namely, it means that somebody would remember the item without remembering any additional context in which it was learned. Another interesting component is called the late old new effect. It occurs around 600 milliseconds, and it is a positive deflection, typically larger for items that are old compared to the ones which are new. And this component is also assumed to reflect recollection type memory. And what it means is that you remember the stimulus and also the context in which it was learned. I was expecting to find both kind of effects, so both the early and the late one, for the abstract figures. And I did. As you can see, it is marked by a star. There was a significant effect for the N400 and also for the B600. Namely, the drawn items' amplitudes were less negative compared to the new and the studied ones around 400 milliseconds, and the opposite was true, around 600 milliseconds. The results with the numbers were slightly different. Here we could detect a significant P600 effect. However, the N400 did not result in an early old new effect. And a good explanation could be that items normally which evoke N400 and are verbal of nature rely on semantics, so they have a meaning. Considering the non-words are nonsense letter strings without a meaning, it could be less surprising that we could not detect this effect. If you can remember, Margaret was complaining about having problems with recognizing the right icons and learning new information. Eventually, she was complaining about getting slower. So in this experiment, I wanted to investigate whether this could be applicable to her peers. So I had a group of elderly, and I compared their performance to a group of youngsters like Joshua. So for the sake of this presentation, let's assume that both Joshua and Margaret participated in my experiment. I was expecting Joshua to be more accurate, especially when he had to correctly identify the new items and respond to the items that were merely studied. I also expected him to be faster than Margaret. And I did find indeed age effects, namely, the young people, including Joshua, were better when they had to correctly recognize the new items. And a good reason could be that the elderly made more mistakes, so they falsely endorsed the new items as being old. I also found an effect on response times. Namely, the young people were faster when they had to respond to the abstract images. This was not the case for the non-words. So you see Joshua again. Let's assume he came with me to my final experiment. In this experiment, I was investigating the effects of a medication called biperidone. Biperidone has previously been shown to induce age-related memory deficits in episodic memory. So I investigated the effects of biperidone against a fake drug or placebo. And I wanted to see whether it is possible to mimic Margaret's memory complaints as described before. And I indeed found drug effects. The drug compared to the placebo decreased the accuracy and also slowed the reaction times in response to the drawn and the studied items. However, in contrast to my expectations, the new items were unaffected by the drug. And to our biggest surprise, the non-words did not result in any differences as a result of the treatment. So based on these results I shared with you, I would now like to tell you and share some of our general conclusions. Namely, it seems that all new recognition is affected by experimentally induced memory strength. And this differs in terms of electrophysiology and the underlying brain processes for the visual and the verbal items. And a crucial factor here could be how effectively one can use familiarity or recollection type memory. Additionally, the levels of processing and the benefits of the levels of processing and repetition seem to also apply to pre-experimentally unfamiliar items. And as we could see in the elderly, their concerns mostly relate to new item identification. However, this is different in the visual and the verbal domain. And although biperidone has previously been found to be effective in mimicking age-related episodic memory impairment, using this paradigm, it seems that it cannot model recognition memory impairments. I believe that these findings are useful for a number of reasons. I would highlight just some of them. First being that we gained a better understanding about why in some situations, old information could be less or eventually more accurately processed than new one. We also saw that the memory impairments seen in the elderly are not global, but relate to specific domains. So they differ in the verbal and the visual domain. We also saw that recognition memory deficits in aging most likely do not solely rely on cholinergic neurotransmission. And what this tells us is to examine and investigate other neurotransmitter systems and other drugs in an attempt to develop effective cognitive enhancers that could make Margaret happier and eventually to become better in learning how her new smartphone works. I thank you for the attention, and I give back the word to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. We will now start with the defense of your thesis. and the opposition will be opened by Professor Riedel. Professor Riedel is a professor of experimental psychopharmacology at our university, and he was also the chair of your assessment committee. Professor Riedel.
Dear candidates, first of all, I want to congratulate you wholeheartedly with the completion of this manuscript. And my congratulations also, of course, go to your supervisory team. And then, in addition, I like to retrieve some old memories of mine that I first met you in 2016 when you applied for the new research master track, drug development and neurohealth. Was it 2016? Is my memory correct? I think so, yeah. And in the context of that, I'm very happy, so I congratulate you again. I'm very happy that you are, as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, the first of those students who did research master drug development and neurohealth that defends her dissertation within Maastricht University. I think that one preceded you in another university. That's as far as we can keep track of this bright group. So I hope you are now in a good mood to tolerate my questions, which will not surprise you that they will be mainly about chapter 5, the only pharmacological chapter in your dissertation. I will start off with a few short questions that mainly ask for some or more clarifications. So can you read out the title of chapter 5?
In the meantime, that I'm looking for it, I'm very grateful for your kind words. And I was really happy to be among the first who could experience that master. And age effects on, sorry, that's the wrong one. I got chapter 5, right? The antimuscarinic agent biperidine selectively impairs memory of the abstract figures without affecting the processing of non-words.
Okay, and I noticed you also have a title, so I will do this once more. I also request you to read the title of the article on the bottom of the page.
The same page?
Yes.
The antimuscarinic agent biperidine selectively impairs recognition of abstract figures without affecting the processing of non-words.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, it's a bit picky what I do, but they are not exactly the same, these titles. And so my first question is, why is that? Is there a reason?
To be honest with you, I didn't even notice myself.
It was
so I don't think it was a deliberate.
It was non-intentional then?
No.
Oh, okay. Then Then I go to my next question, which is about both titles. Like, what is you suggest a contrast. You suggest a contrast between memory of abstract figures on the one hand, and processing of non-words on the other hand. So what is this contrast?
Could you maybe give me a little bit more information about what you mean?
Well, when I first read it, I think I'm puzzled, because I think you say memory of abstract figures. Mm-hmm. Although in the second title you call it recognition of abstract figures, which is maybe a bit more to the point. And then you compare it to something which apparently doesn't have anything to do with memory, which is processing of non-words. So my question is, how do you explain this title? What is behind it?
As you obviously know, and our intention was also to investigate recognition memory. And the processing in terms of how we use that word was meant to reflect on memory processing. So I could have been more precise, perhaps, to use better wording, but the basic idea was that we wanted to investigate whether biparidine would affect recognition. And in terms of processing, what was meant by processing itself is how well somebody could recognize or process the items during recognition.
Okay.
Does this address your question?
Yes. And then I have another short question, page 115, fifth line from the bottom. There it says, this could, so, okay, maybe we should consider the context, but the line I'm asking about is, this could be an M1 agonist such as biparidine. Do you see the line?
Antagonist.
Okay, so that was a typo.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Then I go to page 119. And on the second half of the page, there's a sentence that says, every participant performed each test phase first with the abstract figures and then with the non-words to minimize the verbalization of the figurative stimuli. I don't understand that sentence. How does that work?
The way that we imagined this was that in case we would have given the non-word task at first, and because they were asked to come up with a rhyming word that could obviously involve or maybe initiate a kind of a strategy or technique when they saw the abstract figures, that they would try to come up with something that it reminds them. Obviously, I could not control for that because everybody might have an own kind of way of thinking and a strategy for memorizing. But we wanted to reduce the possibility and the chance that this would, for some reason, induce them or kind of like indicate to the participants to trying to come up with some kind of verbalization. So the idea why we did it in this order was to reduce the fact that somebody would try to see an abstract figure and come up with something that it would remind him or her from without giving any instructions. So again, the individual factors in this cannot be excluded, obviously, because we all have our own way of memorizing without instructions.
Okay, I was struck by that because I'm one of those who has ways of abstraction. In abstract figures, I've worked with that memory test, and I said, well, it's almost impossible to say that you have a non-verbal memory test because we humans can verbalize anything, provided we have enough time. So the critical thing is, how much time did they have?
In the first phase, for redrawing the abstract figures, they had 14 seconds in total. 14? Yes, and also the same for the non-words to come up with the rhyming.
Yeah, that's quite enough time to verbalize, I'm afraid.
To come up with something, yes, I'm pretty sure. It could happen. It's obvious, it's very difficult. And I also believe if I would tell them not to verbalize, it's like, don't imagine an elephant, and then you would surely be seeing an elephant in front of you. So that would not be a good solution to kind of restrain them with an instruction to trying to verbalize. However, it could be a good idea, and I thought about that. And in future studies, in case we will be working with this paradigm, and we do work with it also at the moment, to ask them, or ask the subjects or the participants whether they, first of all, try to make any kind of verbalization during the first or the second phase, or what kind of strategies they were implementing when trying to remember and encode and store these memories.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea to me. So here you did not ask them about whether they had a strategy, or did you suspect anyhow or not?
Not really, because like they were doing the task, and the only thing I saw or that we kind of kept a track of is their drawings. So I did not ask them, and I didn't note that, so it was not kind of like part of this specific paradigm at this stage, but I would definitely like to include this option in the future.
Okay, if I still have time, Prorector.
Let me have a look. No, we're about 9 minutes away, so.
Okay. Okay, then I give the word back to the Prorector.
Thank you. We will now proceed with the opposition by Professor Meter. Professor Meter was also a member of your assessment committee, and Professor Meter is a professor in education sciences at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I would also like to congratulate you with your thesis. It's nice and thick and has lots of experiments. And I also would like to compliment you with the cover. It's really beautiful. And as a novel figure, I think I'd remember it. And with your esteemed supervisors, I've searched for quite a while for effects of memory, of novelty on memory. So the novel stimuli like this, of course, appeals. We weren't totally successful in finding effects of novelty on memory. They're finicky, sometimes they appear and sometimes they don't. Other effects are much stronger. So for example, the fact that your figure is being repeated on every chapter title helps probably a lot more with remembering it than that it's novel. So that gets to your experiments. Well, you have several manipulations, and an obvious one is repetition. So half of your items in every experiment is seen twice by the participants, and half of them are seen once. And you have levels of processing manipulation. Well, you have in levels of processing, you have a deep condition, which is obviously deep, so very good. And you have a shallow one, and shallow one is memorizing the words. And I wanted to ask you first, why is memorizing words shallow?
Highly esteemed opponent, first of all, I highly appreciate and I'm very thankful for your kind comments, and I'm really happy that you like the design. That was also my intention, to bring something novel and eventually to repeat that. So I'm happy that you recognize that. Yes, in terms of the question that you raised, literature says that the instruction to study something or memorize would be more superficial as compared to deeper levels of processing, whether it be drawing or whether it would be rhyming or whether it would be writing. So according to the literature, a simple instruction to study something or to memorize something would be more superficial, reaching more shallow levels of processing. In the hindsight, I have to share with you that I was thinking about applying some changes in the second phase, and that would namely concern a different and maybe more concrete way of thinking and instruction. And that could be that I could ask the participants to rate the abstract images as of I like it, I don't like it. So that was something that I was thinking about. And eventually to count the vowels of pronouncements in the non-words. So that was something that in the hindsight, I was considering perhaps to be a more suitable approach.
Yeah, because you know the literature, so you probably also know that mere repetition is a clear shallow task. So if participants study the words by mentally repeating them in their heads, but if they would be elaborating or trying, for example, to verbalize abstract pictures, that would not be a shallow task, but a deep one. Might it be that some of the participants would spontaneously go for a deep strategy?
I would be very happy if I could give you a concrete answer to this one, but referring also to Professor Riedel's question, I did not ask them. to be honest. But I think it would have added a lot, and it would have given us also a better understanding, perhaps, and more knowledge as to is it worth to change this or not. But I think that it could give me a more clearer picture in case I would maybe instruct them with a more specific kind of like task as to decide whether they like something or not, which would be more concretely shallow as opposed to I don't know what they did.
Yes,
unfortunately.
It's not that it's a deadly problem, because you also have the repetition manipulation. So strength is being manipulated one way or another. Now we go on to the comparison of the recognition of old items versus correct rejection of new. So I want to ask you if I asked you whether the word knant was in your presentation, how would you go about answering this question?
If you would ask me if that word was in my study,
yeah, or in your presentation, just what was it, 20 minutes ago?
Yeah. And the question is whether I would remember it.
Well, how would you answer that question?
Could you please repeat the question so I can come up with
knant,
yeah.
K-N-A-N-T in your presentation? Was your knant in your presentation?
Yes.
How would you answer that?
Yes, it was.
And how would you answer that? Like, what process would you go through?
Whether it was old or whether it was new? Yeah, well, I showed it, so I think it was an old word for me,
so you have
but not necessarily for people seeing it, perhaps for the first time.
So maybe it's so familiar that you can answer it. And knurf, was that in your presentation?
No.
And how do you answer that one?
It was not in my presentation, it was new to me.
And how do you know that it's new?
How I know this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have existing memory representations in my head. And I also repeated the presentation several times.
Yeah.
So I did practice that. So
the fact that you cannot remember knurf is the reason that you would say it's new, right?
I would compare it, or my hippocampus, if you will, would compare it with my existing memory templates and stored memories. Perhaps it would result in some time before acetylcholine kicks in, because it's comparing and trying to recall a memory which is not existent. So I think that things that we know are kind of crucial for us to be able to distinguish between what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah.
And what is also important perhaps here is, I believe, the context. So if you think about the word bank, that could mean two things. It could mean something different for a child who is often walking on the side of the river and sees banks, as compared to mommy, who often goes to the bank to sort out financials. So I think it has to do with the person, with our existing semantic nodes and networks and concepts that we do have. And depending on how often we use them, they can become more durable. And also depending on the quality in which we store them, they can become perhaps more durable, and we can be more sure whether it is new or old.
Yeah, that's a perfectly valid answer. And it's the answer that many models give, that a new answer is given whenever the model does not succeed in retrieving anything. But if that's the model that you have, does it then make sense to say that the answer to new items is independent of the answer to old items, and that you can compare those two measures?
I think it is, but because whereas they seem to be different, because something which is old cannot be new, and perhaps the opposite is obviously also quite true. But before we are able to say that something is new, we have to know that it is not old, and also the opposite. And I also think that there is a degree to which something can be new or old. And from that aspect, I think that it matters.
well, surely is a different answer, but is it a different process? If in fact what you're doing in both cases is search your memory, and in one case you have a result and you say old, the other time you have no result and you say new.
Yes, but it has to do with the capabilities, and as we showed basically that it does. But we found different differential results as a result of the levels of processing. So it did matter how well that memory was embedded, or to what extent it could appear newer, if you will, even though something is old or new. But I believe that there are degrees to which something can be familiar, and that could be also degrees which are maybe individually different. To what extent something can appear new.
Yeah, I have to ask the rector, is my time up? Or?
Yes.
Okay, already 30. So maybe we'll continue this debate.
I would be very happy. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. We will proceed with the opposition by Professor Kenemans, professor at Utrecht University in biopsychology and human psychopharmacology, and also member of the assessment committee.
Thank you, dear rector, and dear candidates. My congratulations as well for your very nice book with substantial content. And also I continue on this cover matter of this, so I'm just showing it again. So my first question is, would you call this an abstract figure or a non-abstract figure?
You have a highly esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for the compliment. And my intention was to present maybe contextual novelty for the cover itself. It did contain, if you have a closer look, some nonsense letter strings or non-words, if you will. And it also has some elements of the abstract figures which we use. And it is all kind of like coated with a DNA chain-like design. So something some people could recognize, and maybe it also has some new elements. So I would not say it's absolutely novel in this sense, but it definitely reaches the levels of contextual novelty.
You mean absolutely unfamiliar? So that's certainly not the case, because you managed to verbalize it very quickly yourself. So let's get to the DNA and then just answer the next question, yes or no, please. My hunch about the relation between your cover and the contents of your dissertation would be that if learning changes anything, it's genetic expression. Is that correct? Or did you not yourself have that immediate association?
Would you mind repeating, please?
Well, I would say, why is this DNA-like thing on the cover? If anything, it is, in my perspective, that if learning, so the creation of memories, changes anything in the brain, it's genetic expression. Do you agree with that?
I know that during recognition, for instance, there are definitely genetic markers and changes, for example, in CFOS expression in the hippocampus. So if this is what you were trying to aim towards, then yes. I would say that it does have a genetic component.
Okay, so we agree in that respect. So now my next question is also about your abstract figures. I noticed from your presentation that the one example that you use as an abstract figure looks something like this. Is that correct?
It was something like that, but there was not a stimulus which was used in the experiment.
Okay, so that partly answered my question, because no one don't know how it's in Maastricht, but in Utrecht, when you meet online with young researchers or students, they all have at least 2 guitars hanging behind them on the wall, and they will surely know an F key for an F key. So they will immediately verbalize that abstract visual stimuli, but then you didn't use it in your experiment. Good.
Excuse me.
No,
there was just an example which was in good resolution for a presentation. So had I used the figures that we used in the experiment, it would have appeared different compared to the ones that I could source from PowerPoint's library. So it was just an illustration.
Well, maybe for your next presentation, it's a kind of ambiguous figure. So perhaps try to avoid that. So my next question is also about abstract figures, and that's something of a statistical problem, actually, because also in your presentation and in your discussion, at least in the article, the chapter 2 discussion, you highlight the finding that only for visual stimuli, the new unfamiliar unfamiliar stimuli are better recognized as new, as not old, than the familiar ones, right?
Yes.
But that's, given your statistical design, that's a strange operation, because actually this test for new, this test for new for difference familiar, unfamiliar, separately, and also separately for drawn, and also separately for just study, is only warranted if you first, in your overall design, find a significant interaction between familiarity, pre-experimental familiarity, and stimulus type, which you don't. So how do you see this? It could have been a very specific hypothesis driven by the source memory confusion hypothesis, but then the way you present it is very ambiguous. Normally you would say, okay, I have a 2x3 design, and only if the interaction or the main effect of pre-experimental familiarity is significant, I proceed with separate tests for perhaps the kind of test that you highlight so much, to state that new, unfamiliar new is better recognized than familiar new.
I was definitely including the option of confusion, because I believe it is quite well established that in some cases, as also I was referring to that in my presentation, it can be confusing. And the reason being that throughout our lives, we do activate those memory traces several times. And I believe also with respect to the novelty effect, it has been found that source confusion, meaning that the distinguishing between, if you saw that within the experimental context or on the way when you were going to the lab, so some boy was playing with a ball, and these kind of like can mold into each other, which makes it difficult to distinguish whether you saw it during the experiment or maybe 5 minutes before the experiment.
Yeah,
So,
I don't doubt the source memory idea. At least I think it's possible and it's a good idea. But it's your statistical procedure that I doubt. So you have a factorial design, familiar versus unfamiliar times drawn, studied, new, right? And now, subsequent, what you do actually is test separately for the new stimulus type for the familiarity effect. That's not allowed unless you find in your overall omnibus design a significant interaction, familiarity times stimulus type, which you don't. You explicitly state that it's not significant. So what made you perform this very specific test for new stimuli in the first place and in the last place?
if I may just ask for a minute to look it up precisely before I
Yeah, I can say where it is. It's at page 34, actually. So your statement that this is case for that new stimuli are better recognized as new for unfamiliar than familiar might support your source memory confusion hypothesis, but then it's not backed up by a statistical result. That's my whole point. Unless you, for very good reasons, you may propose it as a priori very specific test, but I cannot find that anywhere in your introduction or.
As much as I remember, we were testing for stimulus types effects, obviously. So we had two factors indeed. We had the stimulus type and pre-experimental familiarity indeed. And when testing for the stimulus type effects, we found that there were unequal variances for the new abstract images. Whereas this was not the case for the other two types of stimuli.
Yeah.
So that was the reason why I wanted to investigate why this could be, or what is the basis for that, or how this would look like if you test it.
Okay, well, it's an explanation, but I think there are better ways to deal with the fact that the interaction is not significant, and nevertheless you start testing in a separate contrast within the interaction.
I am sure, and I would be very curious to hear your suggestion and approach, and I would also be happy to consider it.
Let's discuss that at a later time. I suppose my time's up, Rector.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now proceed with the opposition by Dr. Kwaadvlieg. She was also member of the assessment committee, and she's an assistant professor at the Department of Neuropsychology and Psychopharmacology at Maastricht University.
Thank you, Prof. Rector, candidate, dear Mónika. Also, I would like to congratulate you with your and your promotion team with the completion of your thesis. It includes 4 experiments with using different kind of techniques, and you have performed it all in a very short time. So I think that's really admirable. I have mainly some questions regarding the constructs in your thesis, and they are already also specified in your title, Novelty and Familiarity. I would like to focus on those 2, and also more in the context of chapter 3. As I have experienced myself as well, designing a new paradigm is not easy. And I think even trying to incorporate like validity, so especially like test and construct validity, but also things like criterion validity, it's difficult, but of course it's really important. And I would like to talk a bit about especially construct validity. And then you have been focusing on recognition memory, looking into the roles of both novelty and familiarity. And I would like to hear your view on how you see those 2 constructs. So I got a feeling while reading your thesis from several sentences, and I could quote one, for example, one from chapter 3. The EEG results indicate that pictorial novelty detection was marked by a combination of the absence of familiarity, FN400, and recollection, P600. To me, this sentence kind of gives a feeling that you see them as being a mirror image. So if something is judged as familiar, it is not judged as novel. And my first question would be, is this interpretation that I get from it correct? So is this the view how you see the relationship between those 2 constructs? And if so, why? On which kind of findings would you view them as being related like that?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and also the question. It is an interesting question, and it is rather complicated in a way, I believe. And the reason being is that, as I said, most of the theories or knowledge that we have, and also if you just think logically, something cannot be new if it's old, and something cannot be old if it's new. So in this aspect, or in this sense, it's kind of like an all or none. So there is a certain threshold that you decide something to be old eventually or new. However, I also think, as I was referring to that the levels of familiarity can differ. And that's basically, I believe, also the idea of the dual processing theories, which some scientists argue to be completely separate from each other and just this high threshold model for the recollection aspect of it. Whether others believe that it's kind of like a conjoined thing. So first something is familiar, and then you eventually remember also the context, which shows recollection type memory. So I believe, or what I was referring to, is rather the level of familiarity, if you will, which has to do with how weakly or eventually stronger a particular memory was embedded.
Okay.
Does this?
Yeah, I understand. Okay. Maybe about this familiarity, I wonder whether you can really even say something about familiarity using your paradigm, and I will explain it a bit. So I think the definition that would be normally or most often used in research, and that I also had in my mind, is that familiarity would be a feeling that a stimulus has been encountered before, without the retrieval of additional contextual details, etc. So it's a feeling, which is, as far as I know, or the way I would do it, I would assess it with a question also for each item. So I would ask them, for example, these remember no judgments. And I didn't see these, this not at all in your paradigm, actually. So I was wondering, why are these kind of measures, first of all, missing? And do you think if you would have included that, it could have helped you to say something more about familiarity?
Thank you very much for this question yet again. And you are completely reading my mind, if I may say that, because there was definitely an idea and an intention to include remember, know, and new, if you will, responses, which could definitely help us to underpin, if you will, the EEG findings and have a more clearer picture about the issue of familiarity and degree eventually of familiarity as opposed to recollection. I believe that I could consider the lack of such investigation as a limitation, but I would definitely want to include such a design or such a recognition phase in which they can tell you whether they remember, no, because it obviously says something about the confidence itself again, or eventually include also confidence judgments themselves rated by a scale, which could help us to also further understand the processing more deeply, if you will.
Okay, yeah, I would also include a scale indeed, because I don't think it's an all or nothing phenomena. I can 2 minutes, yeah. You said already something about the EEG, and while reading your thesis, thinking about novelty, familiarity, I think the main brain regions that it is linked to are medial temporal lobe regions. And you even specify it more in your thesis that you really differentiate, for example, between the anterior and posterior hippocampus, that they have different roles in those two constructs. So this raised mainly for me the question, why then use EEG? If you think that this is really the source and if you're interested in those two constructs, wouldn't it have been better to use a different technique? So that's the first question. Mm-hmm. But of course, you have used EEG. Can you then explain a bit what these components that you mainly have analyzed can tell us about the underlying neural networks that you expect to be involved?
Thank you for the question. I think that old new recognition is quite well researched with the EEG. So we know what the old new effects are and how they look like, because there are plenty of research available here. And I would have definitely awaited or expected to have differences in the frontal and more posterior or parietal regions, which are obviously, and temporal regions, which are obviously known to be involved both in novelty and familiarity assessment or responses. I think that also, obviously, we know that the anterior part of the hippocampus is assumed to be more related to novelty rather than familiarity processing, and the opposite is true for the posterior part of the hippocampus. So I think that an intriguing follow-up study could definitely be something in which this is possible to visualize, and that would be an approach with fMRI, I believe.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. Let's discuss this further another time. I will give back the word to the prorector.
Thank you. We will now proceed with the opposition by Dr. van de Ven. He is an associate professor at the Department of Cognitive Neuroscience at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, I also would like to extend my congratulations to your very nice thesis. I like the topic that you approached in the sense of the strength of certain memories before the experiment, because most experiments use a certain list of predefined items, of which is actually quite unclear how familiar people are with those items. And thus it's a very important issue to further investigate this. And you've done that in various contexts, in age and with EEG, and also with a pharmacological manipulation. And for a new paradigm, I think that's a very broad and very all-encompassing approach to better understand how the role of pre-experimental experience with items influences how we remember things. So I think that's a very important and commendable approach. My questions are also about the paradigm in various ways. And I'd like to start with your choice of motivating strong and weak memories through the levels of processing theory or model, or however you want to call it. One of the things that levels of processing does not have is a clear definition of what levels are. What is shallow? What is deep? How could you distinguish that? And what does that mean in terms of brain processing? By itself, of course, it's not a big problem, but using that as a motivation to say, now this is happening in one condition and this is happening in another condition, feels a bit unspecified, a bit unmotivated. So my first question, I guess, is why particularly choose levels of processing when you can also define that same effect by more defined things such as repetition, attentional encoding, associative versus perceptual processing, etc.
Can I answer?
Question.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. It is a very interesting aspect that you highlight here, and I'm thankful that I can share the back thought about this. I think you were referring to the critique which has been proposed in response to Craig's original levels of processing theory. And one point of that was obviously that the depth of processing is not well defined. And if I remember correctly, he was then giving a rebuttal on this critical point. And he basically used the levels of analysis reaching for perceptual. So when we first sense and see something being the shallowest, going higher to levels which are more top-down, if you will, as compared to bottom-up processing. And those involve comprehension. So when you see a sentence, then obviously you need to sense it, you need to see it. Then you read it, which is another level, and then eventually those letters make up a word, and that word makes up a sentence. So his basic idea was to use the levels of analysis, starting from perceptual back to higher levels of processing. And indeed, I could have just used repetition. You are right. I agree with you. That would have already in itself be something that could have made a difference, or could have been expected to make a difference. But we were considering the nature of the items to be difficult, if you will. So I'm not sure whether a single repetition could have been sufficient to make durable traces enough. And additionally, I was also interested to see whether what we see with pre-experimentally familiar memories, several experiments have investigated this, could also be something that would be applicable to memories which have not been formed prior to the experiment. So the motivation behind using not just repetition and specifically the levels of processing was this also. And because we wanted to investigate EEG as well, EEG is also sensitive, specifically the P600, to the depths of processing. So there are a good deal of data for the P600 and the involvement of the depths of processing in relation specifically to more recollection type memory. So it was exploratory in nature. I totally have to admit that, because we designed a paradigm. We kind of like did some trial and error. And I also can confidently tell you that in the hindsight, I believe that several points could be improved and that could further clarify. But this is a good starting point, I believe, to take this eventually further.
All right. Okay, so then by some means there is a difference between a weak memory and a strong memory. And then the experiment continues in the sense that in phase 2, those two items are presented intermixed before you go to phase 3, where you would test people's recognition also in light of new items. I was thinking that if you first have people very effortfully train themselves on particular items, and then show those items again together with, at that moment, novel items, which are then only shown once, you get into another type of, say, mental state in which other things can happen. For example, have you thought about the potential interaction effects, perhaps in terms of interference or other forms of interaction that repeated stimuli or well-trained stimuli could have on novel stimuli, in terms of memory competition or encoding effects that could explain your final effects without necessarily being purely an effect of weak versus strong memories?
Wow, this is a long question, and I would need to think a little to kind of get the gist. So we did think about interaction in terms of having different levels that were experimental manipulations, kind of like induced by the instructions that we were giving. So an interaction from that aspect was expected in a way. But what do you mean with interaction in the sense of between the new and the familiar?
I realize I left out a bit of information. So what I mean is that if I look at the results of the pre-studied and the one exposed items, the performance on the items they've seen only once is extremely low. It's almost near 50%, 55%. So it's very low. And if I consider how other people or how other papers have looked at, let's say, list 2 versus list 3, so one seen versus new, the performance varies a lot across studies, but it's not that low. I mean, it's not almost at chance level. So I'm thinking, is there some sort of interaction effect like you would have in retrieval-induced forgetting or in other reconsolidation, perhaps, where all the memories affect newer memories, where it could explain why your performance for items you've seen only once, but just now, are performed so poorly with respect to the other conditions.
I understand now. Thank you for making it clearer. I cannot answer confident.
Ora est.
You may complete your answer if you wish.
It was just about the fact that just the stimuli itself could have been difficult to memorize in itself. So it could be just the fact that these are pre-experimentally unfamiliar. And I finish here if I.
Thank you. The opportunity to defend your thesis has passed. The degree committee here present will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I would like to request you and your company to await the decision of this discussion and our return. I presume we are complete.
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Mónika Tóth, the degree committee present here online has discussed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And on the basis of its positive verdict and your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Your promoter, Professor Blokland, is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction according to Dutch university customs. I would like to give the word to your supervisor, Professor Blokland.
Dear Mónika, first of all, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I certainly promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, online, I hereby confer upon you, Mónika Tóth, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor affixed with the official seal of the university, as shown by the beadle. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes, it's a kind of relief. I just, yeah, so we would have pictures now with, but now it's online. I will just continue with some words that I would like to direct to you. Mónika, or I should say Dr. Tóth, Dr. Mónika Tóth. Actually, it has been a relatively short ride in this PG, but sometimes it felt pretty long and pretty intense. Short in a way, because actually you're a research master student, and officially the trajectory of the new design PhDs would be the second year of your research master and 3 years of a PhD. And the second year of your research master should actually be the first year of your PhD. That was actually the original idea of of setting up these research masters of 2 years. So actually, you're one of the examples of how the PhD trajectories at that time should have been done. So in that way, it is actually a normal route. As Wim already mentioned, you are the first cohort of the research master of drug development and neurohealth, and yeah, and you are one of the first of this cohort that receives the PhD. So that's really a great achievement. I also think that Wim Riedel does have some pride in this, that he sees that as one of his pupils who he selected in his first cohort actually managed to get the PhD. Yeah, actually, we used this paradigm, and I think we copied it more or less from Tolving, so it didn't change that much. So we were actually anticipating that the paradigm would not be the main obstacle in this whole trajectory. But along the route, and we found out that there were more problems with this paradigm than we expected. I think we just assumed that it was a simple paradigm. Actually, the paradigm was even more complex because we also used bottom-up and top-down manipulations in the same paradigm. We did skip all this work because we eventually found out that this would even make it more complex. So actually, this is a stripped-down exercise of the whole studies, of all the studies that you did. Yeah. Eventually, but then, so the studies went well, and we made good progress. But then, of course, you have the data, and then you have to communicate with the scientific community. And then we run into some issues. The first issue is related to the terminology and the things they use in cognitive psychology. And I have to admit that Anke and I were also not the experts in this field. But when we came to the first submissions, we got some feedback, and then in this feedback, we were confronted with the terminology. It was about truly novel, experimental novel, non-words, new, seen before, familiar, non-familiar, experimentally familiar, experimentally novel, truly novel, trouble. So it was really going all the way. And some of the reviewers were actually referring to things that the others disagreed with. So we were a bit lost also with the terminology. And so that is one of the issue we had. Then also it was deep encoding, semantically encoded, repetition, shallow memorizing, recognition memory, strong memories, mnemonic encoding, and all these terminologies that were used. And also we got contradicting feedback from the reviewers on all these topics. And then also the analysis with the hit rates, the percentage correct, the accuracy, signal detection theory derived measures, which I think you had this Excel sheet with all the different measures, and actually there was not really a difference when we use all these different measures. Anyways, so that was a tough ride to really get into the brains of the cognitive psychologists. And I have to admit, I'm also not the expert there, but I gradually learn more and learn more that I probably should not go there. Stay with psychopharmacology. A second thing that I can remember from all this writing is, and it also has to do with your writing style, if I may say so. It's not the point that you could not write. I mean, I got revisions every other day and new papers to read. That was not a problem, but in Holland, we always say, schrijven is schrappen. And I know you understand Dutch. So, and of course, if somebody writes, if your PhD student writes chapters, then it's sometimes easy to delete sentences and to make. But I couldn't get my handles on where to skip or to rewrite things. It was so difficult. And sometimes I had the idea that maybe your Russian background, maybe it's in your Russian genes, that you write something like more or less Dostoevsky, who's also writing prosa in such a way that it's really difficult to really get the grip on what's actually going on. And just, okay, anyway, in over time, we got better and better. And yeah, so it was really a tough thing to get to the point in some of these papers. And eventually, we got at least 2 papers accepted, and the third way is on its way. So I'm pretty confident that we will manage to get it published. With hindsight, as you were also mentioning, we might have done things somewhat different, but and also maybe we should have validated the test a little bit more. I think that committee members and the Corona members also alluded to that. But eventually we did extra experiments, and yeah, but they didn't really change the outcome of the studies. So I'm not too worried that the paradigm is not working in such a way. But of course we can twinkle and using maybe other ways to get to a deeper level of processing. That things have been discussed during the defense. But in the meantime, so while we were writing this manuscript and doing the analysis over and over again with different outcome measures, you were also involved in teaching. And you were doing already other experiments. And one of the exciting studies that you're now working on is the study on Ritalin and memory performance. So probably we, 2 of the committee members will be involved in the review process when it's about memory and education and psychopharmacology in humans. Yeah. Who knows? Maybe we get wonderful feedback from them. Okay, to close, at least from my side, and then I give the word to Anke Sambad. I would like to thank the assessment committee who had to endure to read this Dostoevsky thesis, but I'm really grateful for their feedback and their honest remarks. And Mónika, of course, congratulations to your partner Yuri and your family and friends. And hopefully we can celebrate it at a more appropriate time. I now would like to give the word to Anke.
Okay, thank you, Arjan. Dear Mónika, dear Dr. Tóth, as you may call yourselves now. First of all, of course, I also would like to congratulate you on your PhD. I know you worked very, very hard for it, and Arjan already mentioned the criticism that you've had along the way, but you always kept hanging in there with a positive outcome in the end, so I'm very happy about that. We actually met already in 2014, in spring 2014, so even earlier than you met Arjan and Professor Riedel, because I then tutored the course Learning and Memory, and you were one of my students in the first year of the bachelor's program of psychology. And you already stood out in class, not only because you were much older than the other first-year students were, because as some people may know, you already were an economist before you came to us even, but you also stood out because you were one of the most talkative students in class. And I think that the audience now can relate to that because you were quite easy in giving very long answers. And so I noticed you immediately. But it seemed that you were also very interested in the field of memory. And already during that course, you approached me whether you could become a student assistant with me. And that is actually something we did. When you entered the second year of your bachelor's program, you actually started working for me as a student assistant. And you could even say that maybe this was even the start of your PhD, because during your bachelor's program and later on during your master's program, you already did part of the work that is now represented in your thesis. And interestingly, you were part of the Dutch track of our bachelor's program. We didn't have the English one at the time, so you're very capable of speaking Dutch. But because you were part of my English group in the course, we started communicating in English, and we never changed that. But this has led to some funny moments, because whenever you had to communicate with Arjan, you would do that in Dutch. So how then on earth would we communicate if we are with the three together in a meeting? And I think over the years, we had some meetings in Dutch, some in English, and sometimes we might even switch languages during a meeting, for instance, when Arjan was going to have a coffee. So that was quite funny, at least to me, because I always had to switch. And well, anyways, it was fun doing that. And of course, over the years, I got to know you a little bit better. And I think one of the things that I noticed is that sometimes you are also a bit stubborn. Arjan says that your writing is just very lengthy, but I think you clearly have your own opinion, which of course is good. But sometimes Arjan and I would know from our experience that certain actions wouldn't lead to any good outcomes, or that you shouldn't write certain things, but you always just wanted to try it out. And sometimes this worked and sometimes it didn't. The question, of course, is whether this is a bad thing or whether it's a good thing, because you learned a great deal along the ride. And I think that is also very important for a young researcher. And I think you're now equipped with many, many skills that you can also use while you're a teacher in our faculty, because that's the position you currently have. You're a teacher in the faculty. And I'm very happy to have you a bit longer in my team of teachers, not only because we then can supervise some students on internships like the one Arjan mentioned on memory performance and actually exam performance in after giving students manipulation of Ritalin. But I think for the next time, you could also function as a coach to some of our younger teachers, because I think one of the things you can optimally do is getting a great group dynamics in tutorial meetings, which is so highly important in PBL. So I think you're a great asset to the teaching team at the moment. I would say that you should now just enjoy a nice glass of wine together with your partner and with your friends. And I would like to congratulate all of the friends and all your family members on the accomplishment, because I'm pretty sure that they had to endure some bad times as well when we got a rejection again. But now today is a very happy moment, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. And like Arjan said, we're going to have a very nice celebration another time. And yeah, I would like to end with that. Congratulations again. I would like to give the word back to the prorector.
Very much. Dr. Tóth, I also would like to take the opportunity to congratulate you with your new degree as doctor. The congratulations are also on behalf of the board of the university and the board of deans. And before I close this ceremony, I would like to also congratulate your supervisory team. And I would like to thank on behalf of the university the time and effort of your assessment committee and of your full degree committee on making this defense a success. So I would like to wish you a very nice day. And indeed, as Anke said, enjoy your title and enjoy and relax a bit today. And with these words, I would like to close this academic ceremony.